We'll be reading two dialogues of Plato's, the Symposium and the Phaedrus. And in some sense, the central topic of both of these dialogues is erotic love. Now, we call them dialogues, but they're not all just the back and forth of quick conversation in the way, say, that a play would be. Because it turns out that in both of these dialogues, the great erotic dialogues, both the Symposium and in the Phaedrus, the question of erotic life is bound up with questions about rhetoric, about formal speech-making, about eloquence. So, for some reason, a reason that it's important for you to try to penetrate, in Plato's own mind, the problems of erotic life are connected somehow to the status of formal language, of artificial language, of language that's designed to produce persuasive effects. So, while the Symposium is called a dialogue, most of the Symposium consists not of witty back and forth between two characters, but rather of long, rather formal speeches in praise of love by particular characters. Part of the structure of the Symposium, then, requires us to always ask about the speaker of a given speech. What's in it for him? When people talk about love, they mostly talk about themselves. And the Symposium is no different from our own lives in that respect. So that as we listen to today the first two speakers, the speeches of Phaedrus and Pausanias, we want to ask ourselves, what's in it for them? Why do the problems and the possibilities of erotic life arrange themselves in this specific way for these two particular men? Now, in the edition of Plato's Symposium that we're using for this course, I've tried to fill in some of the biographical and historical background that Plato would have presupposed in his original readers and hearers. So I hope that you find the notes at the back of the translation useful to you. The translation itself was made in the early 1800s by one of the great poets of that period in English, Percy Shelley. His wife, Mary Shelley, was the woman who wrote Frankenstein when she was all of 19. It's a rarity to have a translation of a master writer that itself is done by another master writer. There are many more contemporary translations of Plato's Symposium. The reason's not far to seek. It sells. A lot of people still buy the Symposium and still read it. But for my money, which is to say for your money, I prefer this older translation, even though it's now close to 200 years old, for the simple reason that Shelley himself seems to me to have understood Plato at a very deep level. And in part, that's because Shelley's own mastery of English allowed him to appreciate and to reproduce certain aspects of Plato's Greek that even a very accurate contemporary academic translation is likely to miss. So, I hope that the supporting material in this edition, the notes and the biographical material, I hope that that's useful to you as you continue to read the Symposium. One of the things that Shelley does in his translation that we probably wouldn't do today is to translate the names of the Greek gods and goddesses into their Roman equivalents. So, to take the most important case, the Greek goddess of love and of sexuality is Aphrodite. This is a name that then Shelley will translate as Venus. Pausanias' speech will be built around a certain account of the nature of Aphrodite, and we'll get to that in a little bit. One of the great philosophers of the 20th century, died in the 1950s, was a more or less crazy Austrian, which we have a few in the department right now, but this one was Ludwig Wittgenstein. One of the many interesting things Wittgenstein said was that the limits of my language are the limits of my world. For us, the language we have to talk about erotic life is contemporary English. There's much that one can doubt about this. The Greek word for what we call sexual intercourse was based on Aphrodite's name. It's just a neuter plural based on this name. The Aphrodisia, which means the things of Aphrodite. This is the typical Greek word to describe sexual pleasure, and more particularly, that most intense of sexual pleasures in what we call sexual intercourse. Now, think of the difference between living in a language where the name for sex comes from the goddess of beauty, and where the name for it comes from the same realm of your language as words like appendectomy or root canal. Sexual intercourse is a medical word. It doesn't sound like something anybody would particularly want to go do. Would you like to have sexual intercourse this afternoon? I got a dentist appointment. The word, the phrase, sexual intercourse, entered the English language in the late 1700s. Now, I'm pretty sure the act entered the English community earlier. Its first appearance is in a famous treatise on population by Malthus. He's the first person who used the phrase sexual intercourse to refer to nuptial delights, to the conjugal embrace, to use a few other old-fashioned sounding descriptions. The word, the phrase sexual intercourse, then entered our language through the discourse of public health. And more particularly, it entered our language when human sexuality came under the surveillance of the authorities. Sexual intercourse is the way that we describe human sexuality when we're thinking about it as a problem of public health, in the way that, say, fluoridated water is, or the way that making sure that wastewater and sewage water are separate in our cities. At the same time that a lot of human ingenuity was being devoted to those kinds of questions, human ingenuity started to invent a vocabulary, a medicalized vocabulary, to think about human sexuality. much of the terminology that we think of as completely natural is in fact a very recent invention. The word itself, sex, to refer to what we now call sexual activity, is barely over 100 years old. The English language had the word sex, of course, for a long time. It referred to the distinction between male and female. But the use of it to refer to sexual activity, to sexual intercourse, to the wonderful things of Aphrodite, only happened around 1880 or so. So the language that immediately comes to us is a language that's about controlling a danger to public health. It's not a language primarily designed to express the celebration of something sacred. Think of the very phrase sexually active, which is not a very old phrase. Say, phrase and activity break apart here. To be sexually active seems to be modeled on being radioactive. Sort of emit particles of something. Part of what Plato's trying to do in his dialogue is to work through not our desires to control, to neutralize the power of sexuality, but to neutralize some similar kinds of moves that were available in his own place and time. So one of the ways to make Plato useful to yourself, to make Plato useful to ourselves, is to see how Plato's raising the question of the controllability of sexuality, of erotic life. And then to ask ourselves how Plato's anxieties or problems about this are relevant to our own place and time. Now, of course, for us, the Greek name of this goddess of beauty and sexuality, Aphrodite, has been pretty much ruined by having been made into a drug, being medicalized, in the word aphrodisiac. There's an old adjective, aphrodisial, but I doubt that many of us have many occasions to use it. Now, you might think that Shelley's given us a possibility here. If we can't use Aphrodite's name, maybe we could use Venus's name. Come, my love, let us enjoy our venereal pleasures. Once again, until the late 1800s, the word venereal was usable as an adjective that represented the things of Venus. I take it, it probably wouldn't work very well now. I know, take a look when you're getting your Valentine's Day cards. Check through and see if any are about things venereal. The steady pressure on the English language is a steady pressure on our erotic world. The language that we have to describe our erotic lives has a lot to do with what we think is possible or likely in our erotic lives. Plato, in the Symposium, has every speaker deploy a mythological language about erotic life, a language full of heroes and gods and goddesses. Because as much as all the speakers disagree with each other, they do agree on one thing: that sex has about it something sacred, some kind of breaking open of the regular human world, the mundane human world, into something more divine. Now, the Greeks didn't think of their gods primarily as nice. Somehow we've gotten in that mood. Jesus, nicest man who ever lived. Now, that view of our God doesn't actually survive a moment's reading of the Gospels. Jesus was a lot of things, but the first thing that sprang to people's lips who actually met him wasn't, "Oh, what a sweetheart." There was something too edgy, too striking, too challenging about him for that to be the case. Similarly, the Greeks didn't expect their gods to be nice. They didn't expect to be comforted by the aphrodisia, by the things of Aphrodite. They expected to be exhilarated by them. They expected to be cast into ecstasy by them. But the word ecstasy, a word that we'll see not only in the symposium, but even more in the Phaedrus, the word ecstasy comes from the Greek word ek, which means out, and the stasi part means to stand out, to break out of yourself, to be broken open and taken away. And as exciting as that may be, it's not nice, and sometimes it feels like a terrible threat to one's identity. So the issue of control, a control that in ancient Greece, as much as in our own day, was often figured by a medicalization of the realm of sexuality, which, by the way, is also a very recent word. The medicalization of sexuality is one of the main modes of control, of taking a stand against ecstasy. It turns out that one of the main instruments intellectually of maintaining self-control is philosophy. So that Plato's Symposium is trying to work through a way for philosophy not merely to dominate the erotic experience or the erotic aspect of life, but rather to be a vehicle of it. But philosophy comes on the stage as a competitor with an erotic life, not as a support for it or a complement to it. Let me turn my attention then to some specific passages in the Symposium to point out the way that Plato starts to introduce some of these issues to us. The Symposium starts out, before we get to the banquet where the speeches on love take place, with a little frame dialogue. I'll have to skip over this, although there are a lot of things already going on. The little conversation between Apollodorus and an unnamed companion, where the unnamed companion comes to Apollodorus and says, Apollodorus, we heard you know the story about when Socrates and Alcibiades were at the banquet of Agathon. And it turns out that Apollodorus was asked the very same question, to tell the very same story, just a couple of days before. So something's happened that suddenly the relationship between Socrates and Alcibiades is of great public interest. The most likely thing here is that this outer frame dialogue casts the conversation with Apollodorus as happening after Socrates has been indicted in 399. That's why everybody's interested in this old story, a story that's more than 15 years old at this point. Because Socrates' relationship to Alcibiades was no small part of why in the end he was indicted and executed. Socrates is going off to Agathon's house for a party. Indeed, the word symposium, the sim means together and the posium means drinking. It doesn't mean a banquet, it means a drinking party. That's primarily what it is. So Socrates, very unusually, is getting all fancied up to go to this party when Aristodemus runs into him. And Socrates says, "Hey, why don't you come along with me?" And Aristodemus says, "Well, I wasn't really invited." Socrates says, "Oh, don't worry about that." And so they get up to the house, and Aristodemus comes to the door, and he's going to wait because Socrates is lagging off on the neighbor's porch thinking about something. But one of the servants comes up and brings him in. So here he is. He's in this rather embarrassing situation. He wasn't invited. Agathon, though, is a very cultivated man. And notice how well he handles this. Aristodemus shows up. Agathon says, "Oh, Aristodemus, what, you're just in time for dinner. I was looking for you yesterday, couldn't find you anywhere. I'm glad you showed up." Now, it's always possible he was looking for him, but it seems more likely that this is a part of the elegance of Agathon, of knowing what to do when an unexpected person in embarrassment shows up on your step when you're about to have a dinner. The thing you do is to say, I'd wanted to have you here all along. But Socrates is still sitting on the neighbor's porch or standing on it, thinking about something. We never find out exactly what he's thinking about. But you'll notice that when they come in, Agathon has things arranged about where people are going to recline. At a Greek drinking party, you reclined on couches, 2 people to a couch. I have a footnote where I describe the mechanics of the way that it worked. Agathon has arranged things so that when Socrates comes in, there's only one place for Socrates to sit down, on Agathon's couch. So there's a certain amount of elegant artifice that Agathon is involved with here. He sees to it that he's the guy who's close to Socrates. When Socrates comes in, there's some banter about Agathon's wisdom. Agathon, of course, was a very great writer of tragedies. And he had just won first prize in the tragic competitions. And he was a very young man to have reached that level of accomplishment. He's 30, 31 years old at the time. And so Socrates, when he comes in, Agathon says, "Socrates, come lie down on my couch, because I hear that by being close to somebody who's wise, his wisdom can rub off on me." There's clearly a kind of sexual undertext to what Agathon's saying, and Socrates plays along. Socrates says, Agathon, it'd be great if you could get wisdom in the way that you can make wine run from one cup to another by putting a woolen thread between them. It's only much later that that image of wisdom coming through physical contact, indeed through sexual contact, will become thematic in the dialogue. It's in the speech of Alcibiades at the end, which we'll see later in the semester. So Agathon and Socrates are playing with each other. Now, it turns out that the night before was the big victory party for Agathon. And as would be natural for ancient Greeks, I'm sure that doesn't go on anymore, the people at the party tended to drink too much. So they're basically all hungover, except for Socrates, who actually wasn't at the party the previous night, but who also, it seems, no matter how much he drinks, never seems drunk. Great convenience for a philosopher. So we have this conversation about how they're going to run the drinking part of the party. They've had the meal. Now they're going to start the drinking. What are they going to do? Well, they're going to do two things. First, it turns out that because they all drank so much the other night, one of the participants, Pausanias, suggests that maybe we could not drink so much tonight. This is at 176a. As he puts it in Shelley's translation, I'm not very well from the wine we drank last night, and I have some need of intermission. I suspect that most of you are in the same condition, for you were here yesterday. Now consider how we shall drink most easily and comfortably. And then Aristophanes replies. Now, Aristophanes is the other great artist who's at this party. He was the greatest comic dramatist of the age. So you've got the greatest writer of tragedies, Agathon, there, and you've got the greatest writer of comedies. Now, it turns out that this combination of theater and intoxication, of wine, is very important. The way that it becomes important is that it represents another god. The god that the Greeks called Dionysus and that the Romans called Bacchus, where we get the word bacchanal. So we've got a representation of another god here, not just of Aphrodite, of the erotic god, but of the god of intoxication, and also the god of theater. The two theater men, Aristophanes and Agathon, it turns out are also the two biggest drinkers. Because as it goes on, after Aristophanes says, oh yeah, I don't want to drink too much, he says, in Shelley's translation, he says, I was one of those who were drenched last night. What it says in the Greek is, I was one of those who was really baptized last night. It's where we get our word baptism. So, after Aristophanes says that, then Eryximachus, who's the doctor, he's the representative of the medical point of view, the controlling point of view, the be wary about intoxication point of view. Eryximachus says, well, let me ask Agathon here. And Agathon says, oh, God, no, there's no way I could drink again tonight. I'm completely used up. These two, then, are described as the invincible drinkers. So somehow, the god Dionysus, or Bacchus, who's the god of both the intoxication of wine, but also the god of theater, is being controlled or put to the side. So the speeches about erotic love that are going to be given this night are taking place under a kind of shadow. A shadow of weakness, or at least a shadow of unreadiness for intoxication. The sort of ecstasy, the stepping out of oneself, that goes along with Bacchus, with Dionysus, is something that these speakers are not ready for. Now, immediately after they make the decision to exclude what's Bacchic, what's Dionysian, they make another fateful decision to exclude something. This is at 176e. It's in the middle of page 9 of this translation. The doctor, Eryximachus, who's kind of taking over, controlling things, he says, "Since then it is decided that no one shall be compelled to drink more than he pleases, I think that we may as well send away the flute player to play to herself, or if she likes to the women within. Let us devote the present occasion to conversation between ourselves." First, we have enacted the exclusion of wine and of that whole realm of human experience that goes with ecstasy and intoxication, the realm of which Dionysus is the patron god. Now we have enacted the exclusion of something that is at once musical and female. These men, and of course they're all men, claim that they're going to replace the pleasures of effeminizing music with the pleasures of manly conversation. Rational, reasoned conversation requires them to exclude something that they're coding as feminine. There's something softening about music that they don't want a part of. It's going to be simply a man's night. The atmosphere is going to be very macho. Why would Plato frame these speeches about love with these two exclusions? An exclusion of Dionysus and an exclusion, especially because it's coded as the exclusion of the feminine, of Aphrodite. These two governing deities of human erotic life somehow have to be controlled, suppressed, restrained to open up a space for manly conversation, for rationalizing conversation about erotic life. Philosophy enters into Agathon's banquet hall under the shadow of weakness or of wariness. Part of Plato's literary accomplishment in the dialogue will be to show us how these attempted suppressions and exclusions of Dionysus and Aphrodite, of the intoxicating and of the musical, the feminine, how these two suppressions and exclusions gradually unravel. The men start from a position where they want to be able to say, erotic life is a manly life. But even in their own speeches to try to establish that, the Dionysian and the aphrodisial insinuate themselves back in to human erotic life. Let's take a look at how this happens in Phaedrus' speech. I need to say a little bit about the social situation of Greek homosexuality, which is presupposed in this dialogue. at least, and actually our historical knowledge of a lot of this stuff is less secure than we might like it to be. But at least it seems that in certain aristocratic circles in Athens, just to be cautious about it, it was not unusual for older men, say in their 30s, to be erotically attracted to very young men in their late teens. Typically, once the young men themselves were considered to be fully mature adults by their early 20s, they weren't considered anymore to be erotically attractive to other adult men. Pausanias and Agathon were a notorious and very well-known exception to this typical social process. Because Agathon, who in the dialogue is in his early 30s, remained the beloved of Pausanias all the way into adulthood. But typically that's not the way the Greeks expected these homosexual, or more precisely pederastic, relationships to work. So we're in a context where there's a lot of anxiety about a kind of erotic attraction that it seems everybody at this banquet has experienced. The problem is how to think of the erotic interest of an older man in a very young man, how to think of that without it somehow undermining your picture of the manliness, of the masculinity, both of the lover and of the beloved. So both Phaedrus and Pausanias are addressing a certain anxiety that this particular social custom or social practice clearly created in a lot of the Athenians. Phaedrus then is giving a speech that's primarily a defense of the manliness of the beloved, of the younger party. Pausanias is giving a speech that's primarily a defense of the lover, of the older party. It's perfectly clear that Phaedrus was a very good-looking young man, and he may have had many lovers, at least potential lovers, whether they were actual lovers or not. Pausanias was especially notorious, certainly famous, for being the lover of Agathon even into adulthood. So Phaedrus is somebody who, when he's defending the beloved in general, is also defending Phaedrus. And Pausanias is somebody who, when he's defending lovers in general, is defending Pausanias. When they talk about love, they're mostly talking about themselves. Now, in Phaedrus's speech, what Phaedrus wants to do is to claim that the beloved, the younger party in a pederastic relationship, the beloved in the best kind of relationship is like a hero, a mythological hero. Indeed, like the very best hero of them all, Achilles. But to establish this, Phaedrus goes through three mythological couples. The first one that he introduces, well, before I get to the first couple, notice that Phaedrus starts off with a very bizarre praise of erotic love. He says the great thing about erotic love is it'd make you the best soldier anybody could be. So he starts off with a kind of wacky macho way of praising erotic life. Whatever erotic life might do for your bravery, it hardly seems like that's the central way that it connects to human life. But you can see why Phaedrus, whose anxieties are about the effeminacy, the softness of the beloved, needs to make that case. But the first example that he gives, and this is on the bottom of page 12, at 179b, is a woman named Alcestis. Her husband, who's not named here but will be named much later in the dialogue. All of these mythological examples will get taken up again later in the dialogue. Her husband was Admetus. And Admetus could be saved from the underworld, from hell, from Hades, if he could find somebody who loved him enough to take his place. So he went to his parents. He thought, well, what the hell? They're old. They're going to die soon anyway. But they wouldn't go. They wouldn't ransom their son from the underworld. The only person who would, and this was an embarrassment for these macho men, the only person who would was his wife. Now, to understand this example, it's important to realize this. From the point of view that's embodied in this dialogue, Admetus was the beloved, the more beautiful one, the more noble one in the relationship. His wife, Alcestis, is like the lover. Not exactly that she's older, but she's less characterized by beauty. It's an inversion of where we would expect it to go. But Alcestis is an example of the way that a lover will die for his beloved, or her beloved, even when the beloved's parents wouldn't. And in the story, the gods give Alcestis great honors and rewards. Now, notice that Phaedrus has backed himself into a little bit of a corner here, because it turns out that one of the great examples of the nobility of love is of a woman. And Phaedrus, after he tells the story, I think we have to picture him as thinking, well, something's gone wrong here. This is the wrong story. So he tells another story. First he tells the story about how Orpheus, and Orpheus is on the music side of things, the Dionysian side of things. In fact, he's the mythological founder of music. Orpheus went down into the underworld to get his wife, Eurydice, back. And there are a lot of different versions of this myth, but apparently he wasn't brave enough to get her all the way out. And because of his softness and effeminacy, as Phaedrus says, he failed. So Phaedrus has crossed the wires a bit. The one who succeeded in dying nobly for the beloved is a woman. The one who failed to get the lover back was a man. So then Phaedrus sort of erases the chalkboard, says, don't think about those two anymore. Think about Achilles. Achilles' older lover, as Phaedrus says it here, it's not at all clear in Homer that's the way they're presented. Achilles' older lover, Patroclus, is killed by Hector, the great Trojan hero. And then Achilles kills Hector to revenge Patroclus. He knows he can't get Patroclus back. But in order to revenge Patroclus, Achilles kills Hector, even though Achilles knows that means he'll be fated to die himself. And finally, Phaedrus can breathe a sigh of relief and say, whew, now there's a man's man. And he doesn't say this explicitly, but everybody knows it. And I'm like Achilles. I'm like the beloved who would die for his lover. That's how noble I am. So Phaedrus has gone through these three mythological exemplars of erotic heroism. The first two don't really work so well for him, but the last one, Achilles, really hits the nail on the head. This macho way of trying to see love is also behind Pausanias' defense of the lover. I'll only say this much about Pausanias. He tries to introduce the notion that there are two Aphrodites. One is an all-male Aphrodite. Now think of what a dopey idea that is. The goddess of beauty. But there's one Aphrodite that only has a father, that doesn't have a mother. And there's another Aphrodite that's androgynous, that has a father and a mother. And Pausanias says, we lovers are devoted to the heavenly Aphrodite that's all male, not to the androgynous Aphrodite that's too earthy. He makes this sharp dichotomy between the heavenly and the earthy in terms of the male and the androgynous. That distinction is going to come under a lot of pressure when we get to the fourth speaker, to Aristophanes. This Friday, we'll see you at the section meetings, and on Monday, I'll be talking about the first Andre Dubus short story, Falling in Love.